button if you don't mind. Thank you very much. Great. So welcome everybody to this special event. Thank you all for being here. This is a really kind of unique event really, because it's co-organised by the BAFTSS Horror Study SIG, of which I'm a convener, along with the wonderful Laura Mee and Shelley McMurdo, who are both here tonight as well, and the SCMS Horror SIG, which is co-convened by Johnny Walker, who is here with me now. And Johnny, who are your fellow conveners on the SCMS Horror Study SIG?
Sonia Lufa and Ashley Smith, and great. We have,
Fantastic. Okay, so this is a joint organised event, and there's a very good reason for that. It's because really we're here to celebrate the re-release of a really kind of landmark book, I think it's fair to say. Hammer and Beyond, the British horror film, originally published in the 1990s. What year was it published, Johnny? Was it 93, 94?
Yeah, 93 originally. That was the first edition.
Okay, and it's just come out in a revised version, edited by Johnny with an afterword by Russ Hunter. You can see that Johnny has got copies of the book behind him here, you know, hot off the press. And Johnny, am I right that there's a special discount code?
Yeah, there is. So we can put this in the chat, I guess. But if you order the book directly from manchesteruniversitypress.co.uk and enter the code HAMMER21 when prompted to do so, that'll get you 40% off. So
great, thank you, Johnny.
And the paperback retails at like £20, I think. So I think it rounds it down to £12, and it's about 15, including postage. That kind of number, I think.
Well, that is a bargain and a half. So you know, you can't complain about that. And Shelley, thank you to put the code in the chat as well for people's reference. Okay, so this is how this event is going to go in terms of the next 90 minutes. We're going to begin, I'm going to have a brief chat as chair of this event, and I should introduce myself. Some of you may know me and some of you may not. I'm Kate Egan. I work currently at Northumbria University, where Peter Hutchings, the author of Hammer and Beyond, was based throughout most of his career. Sadly, I didn't get to work with Peter. I came to Northumbria a year or so ago, but I was an external examiner at Northumbria, so I had the pleasure of working with Peter for a number of years in that capacity. And Peter was somebody I met right at the beginning of my academic career, and is a really important person to me, actually, in my academic development. So I feel extremely honoured to be chairing this event, to say the least. First 10 minutes, I'm going to chat with Johnny about the revised edition, and then we're going to bring into the discussion our kind of illustrious panel of speakers that we have here tonight. We're going to talk a bit more about the book Hammer and Beyond, but also Peter's career more broadly, his legacy really as a really key figure working in film studies in the UK, but particularly, of course, a real pioneer of the study of the British horror film and kind of the horror film more broadly as well. And then right at the end of the discussion for the last 20 to 30 minutes, we want to bring you all in as well. So, feel free at any point throughout the discussion, if you want to post any questions for the panelists in the chat, or if you just want to post, comments, thoughts, memories of Peter in the chat, you're more than welcome to do that during the course of the discussion, and we can pick up on those in the last 20 to 30 minutes of this event. It would be useful if you do post in the chat to indicate if you would like me to read out your comment or question, or if you'd actually like to come on the camera and comment yourself. So if you could indicate that when you post in the chat, and if you'd like to come and speak yourself, you're more than welcome to come on the camera at that point. As Laura has said, if everyone can keep their microphones and cameras off prior to that, just so we can ensure good internet connection during the kind of panel discussion section of this event. Okay, so Johnny, hi. And
hello.
Just want to say, many congratulations on the publication of the revised edition. It's just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And
Thank you very much
for all the work that you've put into this edition, revised edition of the book. And I wanted to start by asking you, what were your motivations for doing this? How did you come up with the idea? Sounds like an obvious question, but I think it's an important one to begin with, really.
No, thanks.
Revising this book.
Thanks, Kate. Just before I answer it, I just want to just say thank you to everybody for coming to this. It is, doing this is a real sort of honor, really, because Peter, had such a profound impact on my academic career. He was the external examiner for my PhD, and then I worked with him since 2013 when I started at Northumbria. So doing it has been a real honor and a privilege. The reason why was, when Peter died at the beginning of 2018, we were just thinking about the ways in which we could, commemorate him, recognize him. And he had spoken to me in the past, in passing, about potentially wanting to do a second edition of Hammer and Beyond. As I understand it, Manchester University Press had in the past sort of badgered him occasionally about, maybe updating the book, especially given that, come the year 2000, British horror films were really being produced in numbers at that point. So, an edition of Hammer and Beyond, which, took account of the fact that there was this new wave, would have certainly been highly appropriate. But I remember when I was doing my PhD at De Montfort Uni, myself and Steve Chibnall co-organized a conference on British horror cinema in 2010, 2009 maybe, and Peter was the keynote speaker or one of them. And I just asked him at the time, I said to him, are you going to do a second edition? And he said, well, to be honest, if he did take on that, he'd probably have to rewrite everything. And to be fair, Hammer and Beyond very much is a book of its time in that respect. And, as the years went by, Peter became more of a conventional film historian and was less interested in psychoanalysis, for instance, which is present in Hammer and Beyond, but it's not a psychoanalytic book, I would say. But yeah, he became more of a cultural historian as the years went by. So when he died, I just thought it would be a good idea to get the book out again, largely because it hasn't been in print since 1993, and the copies that are available of the first edition were, on eBay for like £100 or whatever, which of course is crazy money. So that was it, really. It was, it's his defining work and deserves to be read again.
Absolutely. It's interesting what you say about, it's very much a book of its time, but it clearly, it is a pioneering book, and it, has made really a kind of key contribution to understandings of British horror. And I wonder if you could just talk a little more about that, for you, as somebody who is very much a specialist in British horror cinema, and I hope you don't mind me saying, has kind of followed in the footsteps of Peter in terms of, developing the study of British horror cinema. What was so pioneering about Hammer and Beyond in terms of its understandings of British horror?
Well, thank you for asking that question and for saying those nice things. I suppose the real pioneering book on British horror cinema is David Pirrie's A Heritage of Horror from 1973. And that really did influence Hammer and Beyond. You can tell it from the period that Hutchings addresses to some of the case studies that he uses. But the key difference between A Heritage of Horror and Hammer and Beyond is that Peter really wants to sort of move away from the notion that there is something inherently British by default about the horror genre per se. Pirrie's argument is that, British horror cinema made by Hammer, etc., because these texts are largely based on English Gothic novels or whatever, that there is some sort of DNA connection between Gothic literature and the kinds of horror films that Hammer was making. Peter is very kind about Perry's work, but he moves it away from that argument and is more interested in seeing British horror not so much as being indebted to past or even as part of a literary tradition, but more as a genre which is responding to the contemporary moment. So he reads Hammer's films alongside the Cold War, the Suez Crisis, etc. And that's what's really pioneering about Hammer and Beyond, is that Peter looks for social resonances in British horror that other scholars were finding in the likes of the social realist tradition, for instance. A genre, a type of, a mode of cinema, which, the social content of that mode is indisputable. Whereas Peter was saying, well, yeah, but also you can find it in these popular films that tended to be way more popular than Saturday Night and Sunday Morning or whatever. These were the films, the Hammer films, and indeed the films of the Carry On tradition. These were the films that people were going to see and spoke to contemporary Britons in a similar way to these other more critically revered films of the social realist tradition. So that's the main contribution, I think, Peter's book made when it first came out.
Yeah. And that was kind of 93, wasn't it? So, it may seem the case I guess to some of us now that Hammer is kind of this institution, this institution of British cinema, but he clearly played an enormous part in establishing something that's now to an extent received wisdom, I think, in the way you described, Johnny.
But also, I think it's important that, Peter, I think, even though his focus was on British horror, he certainly wasn't the only person, reading, as it were, horror films in this way, and within a couple of years, Leon Hunt's book, British Low Culture, would come out, and, that does similar things about a specific period, the 70s, and plug some of the gaps that, were left by Hammer and Beyond. So I just think, Peter was a part of a community of scholars who were taking a sort of a second glance at British cinema.
Yes.
To find value in areas that, people were hitherto, less tempted to say that they were valuable, right? In terms of what they said about the contemporary moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, obviously, you brought this book back out. It's now back in print. People can get hold of it. They don't have to go on eBay and pay extortionate amounts of money to acquire a copy. But also, you have made the decision in this book to also include other pieces of work by Peter. And I would have thought that must have been quite a tricky thing, because there's so much you could have chosen from. Peter, obviously there were the key books, so also the book on Dracula that he wrote, the book on Terence Fisher, for instance, the other book behind you, which I'm an enormous fan of, the horror film book, which I use in my teaching all the time, his dictionary of horror cinema as well. But there were lots and lots of articles and chapters that he wrote as well during the course of his career on all aspects of horror. So how did you go about making that decision of choosing the three pieces that you've now included in this new edition with the original book?
Thanks. I looked at the original Hammer and Beyond, and I write about this in my introduction. Peter isn't, I don't think, as inclusive as he probably could have been in terms of the films that he analyzes in that book, given when he wrote it in the late 1980s. But that said, as the years went on, he did seek to identify some of the gaps in that book and write articles or book chapters which sort of redress the balance somewhat. So he wrote a piece on Amicus, for instance, and he does write a little bit about Amicus in Hammer and Beyond, but I think Hammer is the main focus of that book. So he did a chapter for Julian Petley and Steve Chibnall on Amicus. And the other two pieces, I chose a piece that Peter wrote on Hammer's unmade adaptation of I Am Legend, largely because it was buried in a really obscure edited collection, but it's a very important piece of writing. So I hope that sort of republishing it here will get it read by more people. And the last piece, the third essay that I chose, it was the last thing that Peter wrote on British horror cinema, but addresses some contemporary films as well, which of course Hammer and Beyond, by virtue of when it came out, he didn't write about Creep or Barbarian Sound Studio or whatever, because they weren't made. So that's why, to try and give as whole a picture as possible of Peter's contribution to the field of popular British cinema, but British horror cinema specifically.
Absolutely, yeah. And thank you for bringing those together in the book in the way you have. Okay, we're now going to welcome a few additional speakers into this discussion. So Johnny's going to, I hope, stay with us.
I will.
Good. But we're also going to bring a few more people into the discussion. So I just wanted to first welcome Dr. Russ Hunter. Russ there, I'm happy to say, a colleague of mine and Johnny, a dear colleague of ours who works at Northumbria, has worked at Northumbria University for a number of years, and knew Peter extremely well. And of course, he's written the wonderful afterword for this new edition. So welcome to you, Russ. Also, Alison Ali Pierce, who is currently at Leeds, University of Leeds, an associate professor there, but also for many years used to work at Northumbria University. You're noticing a pattern here, I'm sure, that there's many of us who love horror who have either worked at Northumbria in the past or in the present, and largely because of Peter's influence. So welcome to Alison as well. Also, somebody who we've already mentioned in our discussion, Leon Hunt, from Brunel University. So we were talking there about Leon's contribution sort of after Hammer and Beyond to the study of popular British cinema. So it's lovely to have Leon here as well. And finally, Professor Adam Lowenstein from the University of Pittsburgh. Great to have you here as well, Adam. So can you all put your cameras and microphones on so we can see you guys? And I've got lots that I wanted to kind of discuss with you really about Peter, Hammer and Beyond, Peter's career as a whole. And where I wanted to start really, and this is for all of you, including Johnny, I just want to get a sense from each of you about the kind of history of your relationship with Peter and his scholarship. So could we start with you, Johnny, if that's all right? Could you tell us a bit, you've already said a little bit about that. Could you maybe flesh that out a bit and say a little bit more about, how long you knew Peter, how, when you first encountered his work, those kind of things?
Sure, and I'll promise I'll keep it brief, which I tend not to do, but I will try my hardest. So I was an undergraduate at Northumbria, and I remember we went to an open day, and Rosie White, who I believe is here, was sort of, ushering people here and there, and she was handing out flyers or sort of, bibliographies, I guess, of, the kinds of representative bibliographies of the research interests of the faculty members and whatnot. And I noticed that, Peter Hutchings' name was there, and I didn't know who that was, but I noticed that he was writing on Hammer and horror cinema and stuff. And in my personal statement at the time, when I was doing my A-levels, I was very enthusiastic about the horror film. I just read a book on Last House on the Left, and I really, the idea of, going to university and being able to write about horror films struck me as wholly bizarre. But I was very, very keen to do that. And just by chance, seeing Peter's name there sealed the deal for me. So that's why I went to Northumbria University. But as luck would have it, Peter seemed to be like on research leave every 5 minutes. So I was only ever taught by him once, and then I wasn't really taught by him. It was a really good module on film analysis in the second year of my degree. And we watched one film, The Birds. And it was, honestly, it's the greatest module I've ever sat in on ever. Like being able to watch the the birds and do close textual analysis. But like Peter's sort of, he would do the lectures, but then somebody else was doing the seminar. So I didn't really get to meet him, but that's sort of like the beginnings, if you like, of my relationship with his stuff.
Russ, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I had maybe a sort of stranger route in that I didn't do film studies as a BA. I did a degree in politics at Essex University. But I came back into higher education a bit later. I'd worked in industry and done other things. And I did an MA at Aberystwyth with you. This is all very inbred, but I did an MA with you at Aberystwyth. I'm from Devon. It's all right. I'm used to the inbreeding. So I did the MA with you, and I was looking to do a PhD, and that was why I'd come back. I wanted to teach film. And that was the thing that I was passionate about. And I remember I contacted Peter by email to see if there was any funding at Northumbria, and there wasn't. But then when I did my PhD in Aberystwyth in the end, Peter was my external examiner. And I was really nervous because by that stage, I knew who Peter was. I'd read his work. And in fact, the Argento Effect was the piece of work that made me think about doing the PhD I did. And I don't know if you want me to say anything about sort of Peter as the external examiner, but he was incredibly kind, very sympathetic. I was really nervous. I phoned up a friend of mine, Robbie Edmonston, who'd been examined by Peter before, and I was really nervous. And I was like, what's he going to be like? And because he was such a big name, because he was such a giant in the field, I had this horrible feeling that he was going to pick apart everything I did. But actually, the Viva was fantastic because Peter was interested in film. And so he talked to you about film. And fundamentally, that's why all of us who study film study it, because we're interested in it. And it was actually quite a nice experience because of that. And I didn't need to have all the sort of nerves and all the rest of it. And then anyway, I eventually managed to get a position at Northumbria. I was maternity cover for Alison Peirse here. So going around in circles. And then eventually got taken on full time, and then was a colleague of Peter's up until his death.
Thanks, Rick. And you were externally examined by Peter as well, Johnny, is that right?
Sorry, I keep muting myself for good reason. Yeah, I was. Yeah, I had two examiners. It was Peter, and who was the good cop, and Andrew Spicer from UE, who was well, not a bad cop, but a forensic cop.
The reason I mention it is because there's so many people that I've met in horror studies in the UK who were examined by Peter. You know, a lot of people had that experience of being examined by him, and clearly we're very fortunate to be examined by Peter because, as you say, Russ, he was, you know, very thorough but also incredibly supportive as well. Alison, hi. What, you know, can you tell us a bit about the history of your relationship with Peter and his scholarship?
Well, I first saw Peter in 2006, and he was keynoting at the European Nightmares Conference at Manchester Met, which I was attending as a PhD student. And I've not really been to a horror conference before, and I wasn't really sure what to do. So I just wore a giant dress and loads of lipstick, and kind of stuck with that approach to things as academia has gone on. But I never spoke to him, but I saw him and I thought his keynote was wonderful. And one of the things I liked was, in a very Peter way, he was saying very smart things, but very calmly and in a really simple language that was really accessible to everybody, and just doing it very kind of calmly and quietly in an understated way. So you almost didn't realize how smart the things were that he was saying until you went away afterwards and thought about it. And I was like, oh, okay, I need to pay attention to this guy. And then when I was going for my first permanent job, it was at Northumbria, and I was in the final big interview that you have with like HR and stuff. And Peter was on the panel. And I was asked, what if you come here and you teach like a research-led module, what you're going to teach? And I was kind of umming and ahhing because Peter was the horror guy, and I'd done my PhD on horror. And much of my experience to that date had been was you don't get to do the same thing that somebody else is doing. Like, that's a no-go. You've got to do something else. So I was kind of umming and ahhing. I was going, well, you know, Peter's here and he's the horror man. And Peter wasn't having any of it. He was like, no, you tell us what you want to do. Don't you worry about me. Don't think about what I do. Just tell me what you want to do. And he was like very gracious and very kind. and just let me come in and do loads of horror, even though he was already doing it, which is not the usual experience in academia. He was always all about embracing and developing the research culture rather than kind of guarding it and like barking and growling at anyone who came near. When I first started as well, I was going through, it was kind of like the mid to late 2000s when baking was big. And I was going through a kind of vintage style baking phase. So every time I came up to Newcastle, I'd always bring cupcakes, these really elaborate cupcakes that I baked in like blue or pink. And Peter was taking them, but the second or third time I brought them up, he said, they're really very nice, but you don't have to bake for us to like you. You know, it's okay. You don't have to bring us cakes. We do like you. And I thought that was very sweet as well.
Leon, you've known Peter, or you knew Peter for a very long time, didn't you? Am I right that you first met Peter when you were an MA student?
Yeah, we have to go a bit further back in time at this point. I think I worked out it was 1984. He was just starting his PhD, and I was there doing the MA. My earliest memory of Peter is the day, because we were both in halls of residence for that year for some reason. And in the room next to mine, I noticed somebody is blue tacking a film poster to a wall, which it was Dario Argento's Tenebrae. And I think, okay, I think we have a conversation opener here. And also, you know, it's entirely possible I might have found a friend, which proved to be correct because, yeah, we were friends for over 30 years. So he was starting what would become Hammer and Beyond at that point.
Right. So presumably just starting his PhD?
Yeah, literally
Yes.
just starting, yeah.
Wow, and presumably you knew him throughout that period when he was studying for...
Yeah, I mean, I was in Norwich for 2 years because I did the MA, and then both of us were doing some teaching at the art school in Norwich. I should say also that during that first year, both of us did guest talks on a Hitchcock module that Charles Barr was teaching. And Peter's talk was on frenzy. And I'm pretty sure that became the first thing that he had published, because the two things I remember is the reaction. I mean, I think that's the first time he'd stood up in front of a class. You would not have guessed that. You know, this was someone who knew how to hold a room and, you know, address the room. And I think almost straight afterwards, Charles said to him, "I want that in the book." he was doing All Our Yesterdays, so Frenzy went in the book.
All Our Yesterdays was, I think my dad bought me that book when I was a teenager, and I remember the Frenzy chapter by Peter in it really well. I agree that it's a great piece. Adam, I know that you've got memories of your first kind of meeting with Peter. Is that right? When you first encountered him?
Yeah, absolutely. We also have to go back a bit further in time than all these Northumbria Young Turks. This is going back to 1998. And I was a graduate student. I hadn't yet finished my PhD. I was attending, I believe, well, a very early example of a big academic conference for me, and it was a big conference on British cinema called Cinema Identity History that was being held at the University of East Anglia. I was nervous because it was a big conference, and I hadn't been to a lot of big conferences at that point. I wasn't even a full PhD yet, and I was writing about and delivering a paper about horror at a conference that was not about horror at all. It was about British cinema. For those of you who have read these debates, I mean, this was the heyday of Andrew Higson and John Hill arguing about, you know, how do we define British cinema, and is there a British cinema, and what does heritage have to do or not to do with it? And all those luminaries were at this conference, and I was sort of wondering, what's a punk American grad student gonna be able to do in a context like this? And of course, I was looking for Peter Hutchings from the first moment I got there, because his was the work that I knew best and loved most. And when I did come across him, it was just like everyone else here has been saying, so generous and kind and calm and welcoming. He really sort of had no problem sort of making me feel like I belonged there. I think that's the bottom line. He really made me feel like I belonged. He made me feel like what I was talking about was worth talking about, and just his example being there in his own quiet, dignified way. He really made the case that in this moment where the writing was not yet on the wall about the sort of cottage industry that British horror cinema studies would become, Peter really made a case that if we're going to talk about British cinema, we have to talk about British horror cinema as well. And the paper he delivered at that conference, which is in the conference got turned into a book called British Cinema Past and Present, that Andrew Higson and Justine Ashby edited. And Peter's piece in that book is about Roy Ward Baker, which was a perfect choice, because Baker, as you all know, is important for the horror films he directed, but he also directed a lot of other kinds of films. And Peter really used him as a way to say, this is not Terence Fisher, this is not Michael Reeves, but this is somebody who matters to British cinema. And if we're going to deal with British cinema as a topic, we have to deal with people like Roy Ward Baker. I really think, everything Peter did at that conference enabled me to take that paper and that chapter and turn it into one of the chapters in my first book, In Shocking Representation. And British cinema is there largely because of Peter's example, and not just because he wrote brilliantly about British cinema, but he showed us all how British cinema matters to world cinema, and B, how the concept of national cinema as a theoretical construct is something that a study of British cinema has a lot to contribute to. So I've been forever grateful to Peter and forever regretful that I never had another chance to hang out with him. He did direct me to an excellent pub and gave me some good recommendations on the best drafts as well. I miss him. And I guess I'd say, if I always dreamed of being, the American Werewolf in London, Peter made it possible for me to be the American graduate student in Norwich, but to make that just as exciting and more long lasting than the American Werewolf in London. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you all, and enjoy the book. It really is wonderful.
Fantastic. Thank you, Adam. I want to start because we've talked a lot about Peter as a person, Peter as a public speaker. What about Peter as a writer? I mean, what was it about Peter's writing? And this is for any of the panel that would like to respond to this. What is it about Peter's writing that made his work so influential and impactful? We've obviously talked about how his work contributed to understandings of British horror and its relationship to, British culture, to thinking about kind of, the context in which these films were made. What was it about his writing that was so special, though? Has anyone got any comments they'd like to make on that from the panel?
Well, Alison mentioned his accessibility as a writer, and I think that's enormous. I mean, it's part of the impact of his work is that actually you didn't have to be an academic to read it and enjoy it. And that ability to take work that's emanated from academia, but to make it more appealing and more accessible, I think was, an enormous part of it. And I think why the book is so fondly regarded.
It's definite. Yeah, it's the when I was thinking about, like, aside from working with Peter and the fact that he does horror, it was like the clarity of expression in the writing for me. So, like, technically, his writing is so excellent. It's had like a really big impact on me, like as a scholar, that idea that, like, to be smart, you don't have to use obfuscatory language all the time. You don't need to tie yourself up in 10 line sentences and 15 semicolons. And actually, it's much harder to write with clarity and, like, to write directly and clearly. And I think that's probably like the single biggest influence his works had on my own work, definitely, is it's a huge and unusual, let's be clear, in academia.
Yes.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. I mean, I think there's something about, you know, Russ, the term that Russ comes up with in his lovely afterword to this book is generosity. And I think there's a generosity in Peter, not just as a person, but as a writer. And the clarity is part of that. You know, he's not the sort of academic that hides behind a bunch of fancy writing and fancy theoretical formulations in order to sort of, you know, elude critique. You know, I mean, he's happy to put it out there straight and solid. And if you disagree, that's part of the conversation. And I really do feel like I keep thinking with Peter and to new readers of Hammer and Beyond, you know, people who are reading it for the first time now, I think, you know, the ultimate compliment you can probably pay to Peter is something, you know, I think about Charles Barr wrote about so eloquently in his book, English Hitchcock, where he talks about his debt to Robin Wood. And he says, you know, this whole book is a long yes, but to Robin Wood. And in that sense, Charles is saying, like, there's a lot of things I don't agree with Robin about, but reading Robin on Hitchcock enabled me to make the arguments that I'm making here. And I think readers of Hammer and Beyond will find that energy there, whether you're a dyed-in-the-wool British horror cinema connoisseur or someone coming to it new for the first time. I really think there's a generosity of spirit and of writing that you'll enjoy in this book.
Yeah,
Sorry, Russ.
I was going to say, I totally agree with everything that's been said, and I think, you know, today I was talking to a student about how to improve their writing, and the student was saying that they tended to think they're at university, I have to write in this really florid, complicated manner. I was trying to say to them, look, you don't need to do that. Keep it simple, keep it straightforward. And actually, what I should have said was just read some of Peter Hutchings' work, because actually, I think absolutely what Adam says, it's that generosity of writing which lets you in and isn't about excluding. A lot of academic writing within film studies and without it is about exclusion. It's about showing how clever somebody is. Peter's writing was never about that. And for me, it was really important because I'd come back from, you know, I used to be the operations manager in an IT support company. And when I came back, which is as tedious, by the way, as it sounds, when I came back to academia, I thought, can I do this? Can I, you know, would I be able to write? How do you do this kind of academic writing? And I remember reading The Argento Effect, and it wasn't just that gave me an idea for a PhD. It was also that made me think, actually, yeah, you don't have to write in a really densely heavy theoretical way that might make things really complicated, and maybe I can't get a grasp on this. Actually, Peter's writing was a kind of key for me, which said, actually, you know, you can do this. And I'm forever grateful for that. And I think that accessibility is really key. And I think the horror film book that you mentioned earlier for me is one of my favorite academic books, because I can read it as an academic and get something out of it, but as has been alluded to by others here, you know, somebody else who's not in the academy can read it and get something out of it as well, because that's the kind of writing it is. And it's never grandstanding writing. And I think that's really, really important.
If I could sorry.
Go on, Johnny.
I was just going to say, like, obviously I agree with everything that's been said. but also in terms of how Peter structures his articles and chapters and whatnot. He's a very good arguer. I remember in 2013, I was writing, so I had a couple of articles out that were on British horror, and the editorial process was very positive. But I came to write a chapter for an edited collection called Merchants of Menace, the business of horror cinema, which my abstract initially was not accepted for. And then the edit, I mean, I don't mind being transparent about this experience, by the way. The editor then got back in touch with me and said, you know, we've had a dropout. Would you like to write a thing? And I was like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. So I wrote it and it sucked. And the editor said, listen, man, I mean, this is not verbatim, but he was like, listen, man, you need to write more like Peter Hutchings. It's like basically what he said. And at the time I was raging, but on reflection, yeah, I mean, like, you know, my work has improved considerably just by basing it structurally on how Peter Hutchings writes an article. The end.
Yeah, I think that's true about, you know, it makes his work so compelling, doesn't it? Because it's so brilliantly argued as well and engaging in that sense. So it's, you know, it's, as Alison said, it's enormously clear writing, and it's a very difficult skill, and Peter had it most definitely in spades. I wanted to pick up on a few particular, I guess, sort of key topics that Hammer and Beyond touches on and discusses in relationship to British horror. And the first one I wanted to think about a little bit was Hammer and female characters, which is something that I have to confess is an interest of mine. And I thought, as we have Alison here on the panel, you know, and Alison's you know, very, very critically well received book, which I gather has just won another award.
Yeah.
So congratulations, Alison.
Thank
you.
Another one.
Yeah. I want us to think a bit about that, actually, because obviously there's a lot of focus in Hammer and Beyond, particularly in the chapters that focus on Hammer itself and their outputs, on male characters, on conceptions of professionalism and so forth, and in relation to class. But there is also some discussion of female representations of women, female characters in Hammer, you know, and he actually argues in the introduction that, you know, British horror in general is often dismissed for being a misogynist area of culture, but then actually he argues that British horror films actually offer a degree of resistance to that. Alison, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's something that Peter actually is able to kind of explore to an extent in that book?
I was thinking about this, Kate. So I bought my little Peter collection. So I've got my Hammer and Beyond, and I've got my copy of the horror film, and I've got my Terence Fisher there. But I was thinking about the Hammer and Beyond thing. And so he kind of says a longer thing, which is, it's the case that those feminist critics of horror have argued that the genre is irredeemably misogynist and that female characters function solely as victims, and essentially that the feminists failed to grasp what the horror films might do and how they might challenge or problematize patriarchy. And so when I read that for the first time, I was like, yes, great, because it helped me like position myself as someone who is a feminist, who really enjoys horror and didn't really want to think about horror the whole time being just really horrible to women, which is what people who don't like horror film or don't know anything about it, they just assume I'm some complete weirdo who sits around watching women being stabbed all day, which is not the case. However, although he argues this in Hammer and Beyond, it's the kind of agree to disagree, or the yes but that Adam was talking about. So I don't think in Hammer and Beyond he makes a case for me to actually, I think it's a great proposition, but in the films that he uses, I don't see that. And I then went and wrote an article all about the feminine appeal of British horror cinema, which I published a few years ago. And I kind of set up Peter and a few other of like the giants of British cinema and of British horror cinema, and saying they're all obsessed with Hammer, and they all, you know, they all reckon women are all right in them and they're not really, and blah, blah, blah. And so I was writing this, you know, as a good friend of Peter. And then when it came out, I thought, I'm going to have to send him a copy. So I sent him it as soon as it came out. And I was like, hi, Peter, just wrote this. Wondered what you think. And it was so lovely. And it's not, again, that's not necessarily the case in academia. And he just, the way he spoke to me about it was that he wrote what he did at the time, and part of like going further on in academia is having your ideas challenged and being prepared for the yes but that is inevitably going to come as you become an elder statesman of the discipline. So he was really quite jolly about the whole thing and enjoyed it quite a lot. And he liked the idea that his work, because to him, you know, like he's so modest, the idea that, you know, this scrappy idiot like me was like coming and having a go about like the feminism and the horror, he was really into it. He really loved it, and he saw it all as part of the cycle and the process of academia. So I've always loved him for that, because I was really quite nervous about sending it, if I'm honest.
That just sounds absolutely, you know, the same as the Peter I knew as well, you know,
Yeah.
and very supportive to female scholars working.
So supportive.
As well, which should absolutely be remembered. Leon, I wanted to ask you a bit about, you know, something which Peter, I think it kind of bookends Hammer and Beyond, and Johnny draws attention to it in his new introduction to the revised edition, which is the whole issue of the supposed kind of disreputability of Hammer. You know, Peter obviously engages with that very influential argument from Julian Petley about the lost continent of British cinema, and actually argues, well, Hammer, you know, isn't really the dark side of British cinema, because, you know, these are the films that people actually go to see. But he also takes issue in some respects with the ways in which Hammer, at the time he was writing Hammer and Beyond, had become almost critically respectable, had almost become a kind of institution of British culture. I just wondered, you know, what for you is Hammer's kind of status today? Has it retained any of that disreputability, or does it remain this kind of, you know, as I say, the sort of respectable institution now within British culture?
I think looking at Hammer and Beyond again, what struck me was that he seemed slightly ambivalent about the status of Hammer, because he talks about, of course, there are all those wonderful reviews that one can quote from you know, the Nina Hibbin review of Dracula. There's the Derek Hill piece where, you know, even the posters are an affront to decency. There's all of that kind of stuff. But he also points out that actually there wasn't quite as much of that stuff as other writers had sort of made it sound. Hammer were never as disreputable as, say, Peeping Tom had been when it first came out. Hammer might as well be MGM compared to the sort of Pete Walker, Norman J. Warren films that come out in the 70s. But then, as you say, at the end, he sort of wants to slightly, and I think he's, I don't think he's being entirely serious, because it's right at the end of the book, and it's a kind of signing off. It's like, let's have a, I mean, we often do this at the end of a book. It's like, let's have a friendly signing off with something. And yeah, he makes that point that he doesn't want them to be too respectable. At the same time that he's clearly aware they are becoming respectable. He mentions they've already had an NFT season. 3 years after Hammer and Beyond, The Barbican did a huge Hammer season. I think that but then interestingly, 10 years later, when he does the Dracula book, the monograph on Dracula, page 1, first thing he says on page 1 is, first of all, warning to the reader, value judgments are going to be made in this book. He says, I am going to make value judgments in this book. I'm not going to be the disinterested academic. He then goes on to say that Hammer is, and I quote, a remarkably good film. And then at the end of the book, he comes back to this and says, you know, it's one of the most remarkable British films of the 1950s. So again, this is partly about, as Johnny was saying, Hammer and Beyond being a book of its time. And I mean, a book of his time as well, that, you know, you kind of rethink things, you move on to different positions. 10 years later, he's writing about Hammer in a more kind of evaluative way, and a very positive evaluative way. In 93, he's saying at the end that making them respectable is like dragging a vampire into the sunlight. 2003 seems to have worked out even Dracula can survive a bit of sunlight, and he's sort of, you know, happy to put it out there and hold it up as, you know, a kind of, if not canonical with a big C, maybe canonical with a small c.
So it's interesting how his relationship with Hammer changes and can be kind of tracked from Hammer and Beyond, and then in his later work, Dracula, Terence, and his book on Terence Fisher and so on. That's really, really interesting. I was just wondering, we've said a lot about the horror film. We've given the book, The Horror Film, a lot of love, which I heartily agree with, because I'm a big fan. But I just wondered if there were any other, you know, these are far from his only contributions to the study of horror cinema. So I just wondered if any of you have a favourite book, chapter or article that Peter wrote during his career. I know I do. I just wondered if any of you did. Alison, have you got a favourite article or book chapter? Something you'd like to recommend to everyone?
Yes, Kate, thank you. I've got it here, and I wanted to recommend it for 4 reasons. So it's a book chapter he wrote, and it's in a book called She-Wolf, A Cultural History of Female Werewolves. And the chapter that he's done is the She-Wolves of Horror Cinema. And the reason I want to recommend this is because it's so Peter. Like, it's so Peter in so many ways. So first of all, I'm doing a keynote in a couple of weeks on female werewolves. And I thought, right, I better start working out who's written what on this. I better work out where the land lies. And of course, what happens is you discover Peter wrote like the first big piece on female werewolves. This is just standard. So like, no matter what you research in horror cinema, in some way, Peter's already been there and written it like 15 years before you. So I felt that was very Peter to have already thought about this, published it, and dealt with it. And then the next thing was, he always impressed upon me the importance of the opening first line. Like, we'd have long discussions about the first lines of my work and the importance of making them have a hook. And this one's got a great one. So it starts with the heading, Beyond the Curse. Does it always have to come down to the curse? The curse of blood, the curse of biology. And then, so instantly you're in, which I love. So that's the second thing. And then the third of 4 things is the courtesy again, which is something that I'm still kind of trying to learn in academia, about being really courteous about other people's work. So the whole chapter is kind of saying everything that's been written about female werewolves so far is about abjection and menstruation, which is fine, but there's other ways to look at it. But the way that he says it, he says, this chapter does not wish to like displace or dispel these menstruation readings. In some instances, these readings are clearly effective and insightful. So even while he's putting it to one side, he's doing it very politely and very professionally. And then he goes on to kindly argue his own case without trying to destroy people's careers, which I think is really wonderful and very courteous. And then the very last thing I like about this chapter comes towards the back end, and this is more a personal memory. So when I towards the back end of when I was working at Northumbria, I think it was maybe around 2013, I'm not sure. He was talking to me about the descent, and he was saying how he was increasingly interested in dirty faces in horror cinema, and how more and more of the films that he'd been watching recently finished with a woman with a really dirty face. And he was fascinated by this, and he's managed to work the dirty faces into this chapter. So when I reread it, I was delighted to see that his preoccupation with the dirty faces had popped up somewhere. And it's one of the things that I really like about Peter's work, and it kind of felt like it gave me permission to do that, to have your little preoccupation or the thing that you're interested in, and just to follow it down the rabbit hole and see where it took you. So I was delighted to discover that his interest in dirty faces turned up in this chapter. So it's his chapter on female werewolves. That's the one for me.
That's brilliant. I wasn't aware of that chapter, so I'm definitely going to be having a look at that. And he told me about the dirty faces thing as well. So it was obviously something he was pondering over a long period of time, because I remember having a chat with him about that too. Yeah. And he was telling me about it in great detail and all the different examples in different films he'd seen recently. So it's obviously something he was developing over a long time, that, Alison.
Just to sidetrack a little bit, it's related to that. When we used to have lunch at Northumbria, the floor we were on, we had a sort of a table we would all sit around.
Yeah.
And Peter would usually pontificate about things like dirty faces or woolen socks. So there would be random things, and you could see him almost working through these ideas.
Yeah.
And the topic was definitely going to stay on that topic. And then he would sort of go off. Once he'd had his sandwich and his pom bears, he would
yeah.
go back to his office. But it's because he was just fascinated by film.
Yeah.
And he loved film, and this was a kind of symbol of that. And his interest in film was not just intellectual; it was intellectual, but it was a love of just cinema. And we kind of were witness to all of these ideas as they developed, which was wonderful.
It was a pleasure. It was extremely interesting. If you did try to change the subject to like football or something like that, it would always come back. So we knew where we were.
Leon, have you got a favourite chapter or article by Peter?
I'm going to pick his article on Mario Bava, which he wrote for Russ and Stefano's book on Italian horror cinema. Because I just think it's one of the three best things ever written about Bava, and bearing in mind that the other two are books, and one of them is that humongous Tim Lucas thing, and I think he stands alongside both of them. And because I've just finished a book on Mario Bava, and when I was sort of developing it, that piece was so invaluable to sort of organizing my thinking. It was a piece that just seemed to be asking all the right questions about Bava, and not following the usual narrative, not going down the usual alleyways, but okay, let's look at this in a kind of different way.
I mean, funny that, because I edited that chapter, Leon, and I don't think I did anything.
No.
Peter sent it to me, I looked at it, and I said, oh yeah, thanks. And that was pretty much it, because he was so careful actually how he wrote that there were no typos, there were no grammatical errors, there were no arguments that didn't flow and make sense. And in fact, I remember when I read that, because I had to desperately think of something to say, so it looked like I actually read it. It is a really, really good piece.
I mean, I had the same experience when he did something for a book that I co-edited, the Screening the Undead book, and he wrote a piece about Swedish vampires, and he sent it in, and it was like, I wouldn't dare touch it. There wasn't anything you needed to do to it. And then the only thing was, a couple of weeks later, he emailed me and said, oh, I've just got something wrong about a Swedish tank. Can you just change that? And there's just that one little technical detail that he found. But other than that, it just arrived fully formed.
It was the same again when he wrote for me on Japanese monster movies. His chapter came in dreadfully late, but perfect. It was sufficiently late that I was like, I'm really going to have to prod him about this. I really don't want to prod Peter. It really doesn't feel appropriate. And then he turned it in. I was like, oh, it's perfect. I don't need to do anything. The whole thing can go off. All done.
My favorite Peter thing. Like I said, because I wrote the obituary for Peter, actually, for the Journal of British Cinema and TV. Julian Petley asked me to do that, which was just like such a lovely gesture on his part. And I remark in that Peter's piece on Amicus that he did for Steve Chibnall and Julian Petley in like 2002 was at the time, at least, my favorite thing, but I've changed my mind. And I think the best thing that Peter ever did was an essay for the book Merchants of Menace that my chapter was butchered in. And his piece is on the relationship between the American trade paperback publishing industry and the modern American horror film. So he looks at, Rosemary's Baby and the like. And it's just good old-fashioned historical research. And of course, was essentially the foundations for a book that Peter was going to write on American horror in the 1970s, which of course he never got to do. So that's my favorite piece, for what it's worth.
It's worth a lot, Johnny. And all of those are fantastic pieces by Peter, and kind of barely scratched the surface of the range of contributions he made, really, to the study of horror cinema. But I wanted to finish before we move to sort of think about maybe some questions, and thank you to all the comments that are coming in, by the way, some really lovely memories of Peter that people are posting in the chat. But I wanted to ask you about your memories of Peter. We've already, Leon has talked about when he first encountered him, when he was putting up his poster, and we've talked about a number of other memories of Peter from knowing him over long periods of time, working with him, as many of you did. I just wondered if there were any other memories that any of you would like to share about Peter, as a scholar, as a teacher, as a mentor, or as a film fan, and any other memories that any of you want to share. Because I know that you all have lovely memories of him.
I think one of the things for me that, we don't talk very often about academia as a profession, about the behind the scene bits that are not teaching and are not publishing stuff. And actually navigating an academic institution is sometimes a really complicated thing to do. And I learned so much from Peter about that. And Peter used to have all these expressions that he would sort of wheel out at various points, such as bend with the wind was one that he would say. And that would be if I was getting irate about something. When I first started, I used to get really worked up about all these tiny annoying things that universities do. And Peter would then, sort of very calmly kind of say, bend with the wind. And initially, I actually found it quite irritating, because I was annoyed. But actually, I came to really appreciate and understand and love that, because it was eventually, you do think, yeah, it's not worth getting overly exorcised about, this particular thing. And I think what was really nice was when, after Peter died, we arranged a kind of memorial evening at the Tyneside Cinema in Newcastle, and we'd managed to raise some money to put his name and some film quotes across the back of lots of the seats in one of the auditoriums. And we managed to include lots of his little phrases in there as well. I snuck in a lot of these little Peter phrases in there as well. And one of the things that always strikes me, and it says something about his writing too, was he would often say to people, if they were struggling over something and taking a long time to do something, he would sort of very gently and very calmly say that you should put an amen to it now. And that was a great thing with writing. It was something that I know Gabby Smith, one of his ex-PhD students, told me that when she was struggling with writing, that's what he would say to her. And it was a kind of way of saying, just do it, move on. At a certain point, we have to submit and finish the thing we're writing and then kind of move on to the next thing. And I think for me, that was the great thing about working with Peter. Not only was he, a very generous spirit and a very nice guy and a great person to work with, but I learned a tremendous amount about the behind the scenes stuff of academia and how to cope with it and how to last, because it's a career that can burn you out. And I think that was the really great thing, was just this calming presence who kind of put things into perspective.
Can I pick up on that as well? It's basically like my version of bend with the wind, to be honest. It's just kind of repeating what Russ said. But when I started at Northumbria, after I'd worked there a bit, I got made programme leader, and that opened me up to a whole new host of emails asking me to do things that I thought were stupid and pointless. And I spent quite a lot of time replying to emails from kind of central management or faculty, explaining why these things were like stupid or pointless, and I wouldn't be doing them. And it turned out that the more emails you write, the more emails come back. And I was getting more and more annoyed by like the stupidity of everything. And Peter is just like, just don't reply. Just don't reply. Just don't reply. When they ask you to come in on a Saturday afternoon and sit at a monitor in case of any international students dialing in, and you've got to do this for 3 hours, and just don't message them back and say, no, this is why I'm not doing it. Just delete the email. Just delete it. And he said, if it's really important, they'll email again, and just ignore it again. Just ignore it again. If it's really important, they'll email you a third time, and like third or fourth time, you probably do need to reply to it at that point. And that's one of the main things I've taken through as a professional academic, the amount of unread, deleted emails. It's just a joy. And like the realization that if it is important, I'll try again. It was like mind-blowing to me. So that was my bend with the wind, and it served me well. And I literally last week I was telling a more junior colleague about this because they were getting very upset about something. I was like, just delete it. Just delete it. It's fine. It's great.
People in the chat are also appreciating that advice and holding it in high regard. I think people are saying it's good to know this.
Yes.
Leon, how about you? Any other memories?
I'm thinking back to the 2 years when I was in Norwich with him, and I think everyone will testify there was no one better to talk films with. But also we saw so many films together in those 2 years, and we would do excursions to the Scala in London and Italian horror triple bills and so on. And the thing is, as well as him being a great person to talk film with, he was also a great person to watch films with, because the thing I remember is every so often in a film there would be something. It might be a composition, a camera movement. If it was a Hammer film, it was probably something quite gruesome. And what you would hear from Peter would be what can only be described as a sort of exhalation of cinephile delight. It would be like a sort of, it just this sort of pleasure at something absolutely wonderful happening on the screen, which really made the experience that little bit better.
Imagine it's quite a thing to watch a horror film with Peter in the cinema for that reason. Johnny, sorry, you were going to...
Yeah, no, sorry.
As well.
I just feel compelled. Like, this is the kind of thing that I could get emotional at, because it was a very sort of like touching encounter. I remember, so I'd been at Northumbria for about a year, and Peter was keynoting at an event at the University of Bedfordshire that the great Austin Fisher legend arranged on spaghetti cinema, spaghetti horror or something it was called. And Russ was there, and I was there, and some of the obviously other people were there. But anyway, for the conference meal, we all went out, and Peter got a little bit drunk. Now, the thing is, Alison was talking earlier about, when she first encountered Peter and how calm he was and sort of how serious he was and all the rest of it. And like, seeing Peter sort of let his hair down, as it were, is a rare sight. So, those of you who've seen it, count yourself lucky. So we'd been out for a curry, and I was sat opposite Peter, who was sat next to Catriona McCall, a scream queen from Lucio Fulci's films and whatnot. So that was a sight to behold. But then we all went back to the hotel bar, and at the time, I'd been there for about a year. You don't know how well you're fitting in necessarily, and all the rest of it. your first academic post, and Peter sort of half cut, just sort of like put his hand on me and went, "You fit right in, mate." which it was just like it was like it was Christmas. Do you know what I'm saying? It was just a very sort of like, it was what I needed to hear, basically.
Hey, can I just say something I think the most touching thing for me was I've seen it. Gaz Bailey, festival director of Abattoir, has put it in the chat there. Peter started to go to Abattoir, and probably the last 4 or 5 years, I think, of his life, he sort of discovered horror film festivals. It was really strange because for someone who was such a horror fan, who never wanted to be called a fan, incidentally, he really resisted that term. It was surprising he'd never really been before, but he absolutely loved Abertoir, and he had a connection because his sister Sally lives in Aberystwyth, where the festival's based. Peter really absolutely fell in love with it. I made sure that year, the first year he went, I was on the pub quiz team with Peter, in which I didn't answer a single question or really do anything. But you know, it was good. But Peter did a talk anyway on Peter Cushing, and Peter Cushing was one of Peter's idols, I think, in cinema generally, not just within horror cinema. And I've never seen a public talk so well received. Peter got a standing ovation at the end of this. And bear in mind, it's a film festival and you've got an academic coming in to give a talk about Peter Cushing. But Peter was so passionate about it. And I think he started to tear up at the end when he started to talk about what a gentleman Peter Cushing was. And I think I'd never seen that side of him before until then. And as Johnny says, it's the letting the hair down thing and all of that. But actually seeing that absolute passion for film spill over into something which didn't have to be academic. It was just a talk he did on Peter Cushing that he really wanted to tell people about how interesting and how great this guy was. And to see him sort of well up, and then to see him get a standing ovation was utterly amazing. I feel quite emotional now, but it was a really amazing thing, because as academics that doesn't happen, you know, to us. But it did, because Peter's talk was just brilliant. It was as simple as that. It was just brilliant.
And really fitting as a result that Cushing is on the front of the new edition, really, because of that long-standing kind of bond he had with Cushing.
Can I just say one final thing as well on Abertoir? After Peter passed away, in Abertoir every year in the bar they have cocktails named after horror films and people in horror films, and they created a cocktail called the Hutch, which I drank many of when I went that year, which I thought was just really, really lovely, because Peter absolutely adored Abertoir and being at the festival.
I remember at Abertoir as well, just while we're talking about this, and I'm sorry, this might be very boring for people, but I feel compelled to say it all the same. Russ, the same year that I'm just talking to you now, Russ, directly, the same year that Peter did the Peter Cushing thing, was that the same year that we were doing the Court of Cult, where we all had to sort of like, yeah. Well, for that, I remember Gaz, one of the principal organizers, was dressed as a judge, and he came down with a gavel, and he was hitting a copy of Peter's book on Terence Fisher that he'd got out of the bookshop, and just like defaced this book by like hammering it with a gavel as like sort of like a joke, which Peter just wasn't aware of, which I still thought was quite an audacious move, and I laughed. I enjoyed it very much.
I just wanted to thank everybody who's been putting, including Gaz there. Hi, Gaz, your lovely memory that Russ just referred to when Peter gave that talk about Cushing in that Court of Cult event. But also, I want to say hello to Rosemary, Peter's mother, who has put a comment in the chat as well, saying thank you all for the lovely comments about Peter. I'm so proud. So hi, Rosemary. It's really lovely to have you here, to say the least. But also we've got so many memories from people here in the chat, people who were taught by Peter, who were supervised by Peter. So thank you all for those memories. Really, really lovely and really, really valuable perspectives on Peter, you know, and the impact he had on so many people through his teaching, as much as through his writing and through his public speaking. Just wondered if anybody in the audience had any questions for the panelists at all, or any comments they wanted to make about Peter's work. Adam, hi, you've got your hand up there. Do you want to put your mic on and your camera?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for an awesome roundtable. It's been a genuine pleasure just to be a fly on the wall in this, and just to hear all of the cool memories and all of the, celebration of such a, legacy of scholarship from Peter Hutchings. My one defining memory of Peter, I've got to say, is when I went to the first Horrorcore Exploitation Media Symposium in Northumbria as a little trembling third-year undergraduate student, being like, oh my God, there's actual academic events going on all about horror and cult and stuff. And just, watching the panel, he was on the panel on the first event, and just seeing, like, again, as just to echo what everyone else has been saying about, the grace and, the finesse of, like watching these graduate students deliver 10-minute papers and just, giving such incisive but like valuable feedback about like, this is, exactly how you can elevate this to the next level. So I wanted to sort of like, ask generally to the panel, like, like Peter's sort of relationship with yourselves or other graduate students you might have known. I think, like that's something which, I recognize that, from conversations I've had, and again, I was, based at UEA myself, had Mark Yankovic as my own supervisor there. And again, I've had some very, very cool conversations about Peter's work with him. So just, like about, uplifting, frankly, like graduate students who want to, get into this field and study these things. So yeah, very open question, bit rambly, sorry.
Any thoughts from anyone on the panel? Johnny? So
well, I was just gonna comment on my Viva really. Peter was he's a straight talker, which is helpful. But he gave me some very good advice. So I was writing on the stereotype, and I was drawing from Homie K. Barbar's work, which of course is very verbose and all the rest of it. And he just said, just cut it out and replace it with Richard Dyer. So that's exactly what I did. And now I've got a PhD.
He's always got the answer, isn't he, Hutch? He always has the best advice and the answer to solve these problems. Alison?
Yeah, I was going to say mine's not like an official scholar thing, but the whole time that I worked at Northumbria, and that particularly when I was in the hub, which is what Russ was discussing, when we all had offices together and we shared a table, we'd have coffee every morning, Peter really tried his best to educate me on the importance of Nicolas Cage films. And he had like all the Nicolas Cage films on DVD, and he kept insisting on lending them to me. And because Peter lent me them, I couldn't be like, all right, cheers, mate, and then put it away somewhere. I had to go watch it. So a really enduring part of the time that I lived in Newcastle was me and my husband sitting through lots of Nicolas Cage films and then finishing. And at the end, we'd sit next to each other on the sofa and we go, thank you, Peter. And then we put it back in the box again and give it back to him afterwards. He never quite convinced me, but...
That's the thing, he had such a sort of diverse and eclectic taste, didn't he? Because I've talked with, before I worked at Northumbria, I'd talked with colleagues there about his inexplicable love for Iron Man 3, which he thought seemed to think was one of the best films ever made. So, and that was another really...
And he loved Pacific Rim. He was big on Pacific Rim as well. He thought that was excellent, and as did I. So.
Absolutely. Any other comments in response to Adam's question from anybody in terms of Peter's support for Russ, for instance? Have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it echoes some stuff that Alison had said earlier on, really, which is I think Peter was never trying to keep people out of academia. He wasn't a gatekeeper. He was trying to bring people into it, which I think is really important. He was immensely supportive, and actually, with his PhD students, for instance, he wasn't just a PhD supervisor. He used to sit and listen and talk and advise on all sorts of personal issues and all sorts of other things that were maybe slightly beyond his sort of ken, and maybe also made him sometimes a bit uncomfortable. Sometimes there would be things that he probably didn't really know how to deal with, and Peter used to always say that he was terrible with people things, but he was actually really good because he would just listen, and he would listen to people and then maybe give some sort of practical advice. And when you're doing a PhD, actually, it's a long, quite lonely road. Sometimes it's frustrating, sometimes it's difficult. And I think having someone with a sensible head who had that ability to say, put an amen to that, or actually, you don't really need to worry about that. That doesn't matter. That's really, really crucial. And he was super supportive.
Any further questions from anyone? Any questions or comments from anybody to the panel, or just in general about Peter? Anything that anyone wanted to contribute to the discussion? Put your hand up if so. While we're doing that, I'm going to go through some of these comments here and read some of them out. So Laura has actually commented and said that she's very lucky to have Peter as her examiner, and entirely concurs re having him on Vivas. Very kind and so very interested in my work and my ideas. He quizzed me for about 20 minutes about what I thought a metaphor was, which melted my brain. At the end, he said he had to try and find something to test me with. As a wannabe horror scholar, it was a wholly intimidating and utterly lovely experience. So, you know, I'm again showing what an experience it was for those people who were lucky enough to be examined by Peter as doctoral students. Got Rui here saying, I really owe Peter having the opportunity. Sorry, I've just lost that one. Sorry about that.
I've got it.
Yeah.
Have you got it?
I've got it. I really owe Peter having the opportunity of doing my PhD at Northumbria. A couple of years after I first emailed Peter about my will to do a PhD on European horror, I was at Northumbria. Obviously, also thanks to my main supervisor, Johnny Walker, so thank you both. And then Amy here, Amy Woodfine, is saying, I met Peter when I was an undergrad at Northumbria and was actually in the last horror module taught by Peter. I read a lot of his pieces before meeting him, so I was really eager to meet him, and he didn't disappoint. He's had a lasting impact on me. He's definitely one of those people you never forget. You also fall into that category, Johnny, Amy says, and looking forward to reading this book. David, hi David, David Evans Powell is saying, I only met Peter once. He was the keynote speaker at the Beasts of the Forest conference at St Mary's in 2017. The first ever conference I attended. He was the reason I went. I'd read Hammer and Beyond and his Visual Culture in Britain article on uncanny landscapes, both of which remain staple sources for just about anything I write. And I really wanted to meet him. I was a bit starstruck, but it was wonderful to hear him speak and to have met him, if only briefly. Tom as well, Tom May, I know you put a memory in here as well. Here we are. When taught by Peter in my MA in 2004 to 5, I remember him specifically recommending I read Leon Hunt's British Low Culture, which Johnny has mentioned. He was definitely part of an important academic movement in taking seriously films which were usually summarily dismissed. Peter truly did excavate Julian Petley's Lost Continent of British cinema. And Tom's actually written a tribute article as well, and there's a link to that in the chat if anyone's interested in having a look at that. So that's some of the memories in the chat there. Johnny, in that respect, in terms of thinking about, you know, Peter's legacy and the way in which he's inspired sort of later generations of horror scholars, just wonder, you know, what do you see as the kind of key studies? We've obviously mentioned Leon's work, but the key studies that have kind of followed on from Peter in terms of building on his work, building on those insights about British horror, and, you know, also in terms of taking that kind of investigation of British horror and the traditions around it into the sort of 21st century.
I mean, that's a big question. I think, I mean, I'm not even going to give it a good answer, to be honest. I think there's been so many hugely significant writing on British cinema since Hammer and Beyond. And that's not to say necessarily that Hammer and Beyond was necessarily the catalyst per se. I mean, you know, Leon was, you know, writing alongside Peter and all the rest of it. And I think, for the record, Leon, while you're here, British Low Culture is like the jewel in your crown, in my opinion. It's a horrendously underrated piece of work, that book, and I go back to it all the time. Steve Chibnall's stuff on Peter Walker, again, I mean, Steve, I don't think he would necessarily cite Hammer and Beyond as the book that inspired him to do that, but I do think Steve's writing on Pete Walker, Leon's stuff, Peter's stuff, just in the 90s, it was, you know, British horror was getting a look in, which I think is hugely significant. Helen Wheatley's stuff on Gothic television. Can I throw my own stuff in there? I mean, if I hadn't met Peter, I may never have studied British horror cinema. And, you know, so in many respects, I owe my academic career to the writing and the academic mentorship of Peter Hutchings, you know, and I'm super grateful for that.
I just wondered, maybe another unanswerable question, but to kind of finish off, you know, what kind of scholar do you think Peter was? What can we learn from him and the way he approached his job, his profession, you know, his kind of status as a researcher in film studies. You know, what can we learn from that fundamentally, from Peter, you know, in terms of the example Peter has given us?
Could I answer just initially? Sorry, is
Yes,
that okay?
Yes.
It's because I feel like Adam Lowenstein did it earlier actually, and I wrote it down because it felt really important. Which was Peter gave him the sense that what I was talking about was worth talking about, and certainly like in the early 2000s when I was doing my PhD on horror, although horror was getting started, it wasn't like as huge as it is now in the academy, and it was incredibly invaluable to me as like a very junior scholar to have someone who was doing horror, but not just I'm doing horror and I don't care what people think. It wasn't like that at all. It was just this is what I do, and this is what I'm interested in, and this is why I'm interested in it, and this is why I care about it. And just a quiet kind of, there was no sense of defensiveness with Peter as a scholar. There was no sense of needing to legitimize what he was doing or justify, now why do we need to do that? Like, he was just like, this is what I like doing, and this is why it's worth talking about. And there's a kind of a quiet calmness to that, and it's something that has just always given me confidence to go forwards and just to say, well, these are the things, whether it's dirty faces or female werewolves or whatever, these are the things that interest me, and I'm going to go down my own little rabbit hole to see where they go, and I'm just not having to have any angst about that.
Yeah,
just if that makes sense.
Absolutely, to not apologize for your interest, to plough your own furrow in academia,
and be fine with it, and just be fine. You'll just do you doing you. Like it's okay. Like that is a huge relief, I think, particularly as an early career scholar, that you're allowed to just think like that. Like, it's quite important.
I'm glad Ali said that. I'm just going to say this one thing, if you don't mind. When Peter gave his inaugural professorial lecture at Northumbria, I was doing my MA at Newcastle at the time, and we all came over, and the mayor of Gateshead was there. Or maybe not Gateshead, the mayor of somewhere. Somebody with a big chain was there.
Yeah.
And Peter did his talk, and he had a picture of Peter Cushing on one of the slides, and beneath it just said, "No apologies." And then he proceeded to say what Ali just said. So thanks for reminding me of that, Ali.
My pleasure.
Leon, Russ, any last comments in terms of thinking about Peter and the kind of scholar he was?
I think sorry, go on.
No, go ahead, Russ.
I was just going to go back to something, a word Adam used earlier on, which was dignity. And it also relates to what Ali has just said. It's really important, I think, in this job that you're able to maintain a sense of dignity and have a confidence in what you're doing. But also, I remember, for instance, Peter helping me to respond to some reader reports for a book proposal I'd done. And, he was great at cutting through the nonsense and just saying, don't get involved in emotive language, take the emotion out of everything and just directly respond calmly with dignity to what someone has said to you. And I think that's advice you can apply across academia, whatever you do. Whether you're asking someone a question at a conference, whether you're writing something, you're writing a book review, whether you're doing a reader report, whatever you're doing, is to do it with dignity. And I've tried to do that when I've done reader reports or whatever I've done, to look at things critically, because that's what we do, but to be dignified about it and not be personal, take the emotion out of it. And that's what's always stuck with me, I think.
And Leon?
I think it's this extraordinary balancing of the passionate and the sensible, which is a very difficult thing to sort of play off. The going down the rabbit hole, but let's be sensible when we get down the rabbit hole.
Definitely.
I think that's a lovely place to end this discussion. It's gone so quickly, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I felt really privileged to be chairing this discussion. It's been fascinating. So I just want to thank Russ Hunter and Leon Hunt and Alison Peirse and Adam Lowenstein and in particular Johnny Walker. Congratulations again, Johnny, on this fantastic achievement and fantastic kind of tribute to Peter and his work. So thank you very much to everyone for attending as well and for all your comments.
Thank you, Kate. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just need to plug. I just need to say, Russ. I just want to personally thank Russ for writing the afterword, because I think, you know, this was never intended to be an academic project that was designed to make an intervention. It was designed as a tribute to Peter, and Russ was hugely supportive. I mean, it's really, we cannot understate how supportive Russ was as a colleague in Peter's final month. So thank you, Russ, very much.
Thank you, Russ.
Actually, one of the things that I'm about to cry now on camera.
I can see, I'm thinking, don't cry, because then I'll cry.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that I'm proudest of ever having written is the afterword for this book. And just because it came from a place that was very personal, and it meant something to me in a way that nothing else I've ever written has or probably will. And yeah, I mean, thank you for everybody tonight, because it's been great to share memories and talk about Peter. And thanks to everybody for listening. And thanks to you, Kate. And again, thanks to Johnny for all your hard work with it.
I wish I could give you all a hug right now. I really do. But thanks everybody, and thanks. You know, I can see people saying in the chat that they've enjoyed this event and that they've found it to be a wonderful evening, and I certainly have too. So thanks everybody for coming. We've recorded this event. If you'd like to revisit it, it'll be on our BAFTSS website. And for now, all the best, and speak to you soon, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.